It was an ordinary, unremarkable day. James was walking home from work when he noticed a woman on the side of the road. Her car had its hazard lights on and she was clearly in despair, trying unsuccessfully to change a flat tire. It was getting late and getting dark outside. James, without thinking, stopped to help. As he approached, he noticed the woman fidgeting as she tried to hold onto the jack, which kept slipping. He smiled kindly and offered to help. Despite her hesitation, she agreed, nodding her head in gratitude. A few minutes later, thanks to James's experience and strong hands, the tire was replaced and the woman was finally able to breathe a sigh of relief. She thanked him, tears of relief glistening in her eyes. They exchanged a few words, after which she got into the car and drove away. James returned to his car, feeling an inner satisfaction that he had been able to help. He did not attach any special significance to what had happened, perceiving it as a normal kind act that we do in everyday life. However, the next day his quiet life was disturbed. When he looked out the window, he saw a large black SUV pulling up to his house. James was surprised, because he was not expecting guests, especially such impressive ones. The driver remained in the car, and a man in a formal suit came out of the back door. He confidently walked towards James's house, and when the doorbell rang, James had a feeling that this visit would change his life. James approached the door with a slight nervousness. He could not understand who could come to him in such a car and for what purpose. When he opened the door, he saw a tall man in an impeccably tailored suit with a serious expression on his face. The stranger greeted him politely and, before James could say anything, introduced himself as Mr. Harrison. "Mr. James?" he asked, although he seemed to already know exactly who he was talking to. James nodded, looking at his guest in bewilderment. "I'm here to thank you for what you did yesterday," Mr. Harrison began, but seeing the surprise on James's face, he quickly added, "You helped a woman on the road. She's my wife." James didn't immediately understand what was going on, because he hadn't expected his simple act to receive such a response. He nodded sheepishly, feeling a little awkward from such attention. However, Mr. Harrison, noticing his embarrassment, quickly continued, "James, you didn't just help my wife, you saved her. She was being followed by a car while she was driving down this road. The person driving it was planning to do something terrible, but your help ruined their plans. When they saw someone stop and help her, they abandoned their plans and drove away." Mr. Harrison's words stunned James. He had no idea that his kind act could save someone's life, but the surprise didn't end there. "We investigated and found out who was behind this. These are very powerful people with whom I have had conflicts for a long time. They knew that they could not harm me directly, and so they chose my wife as a way to get revenge." Mr. Harrison paused, as if considering what to say next. "But that's not all. Yesterday, after you helped my wife, I realized that you were being followed. People connected to those who wanted to harm my family found out about you. They realized that you accidentally interfered with their plans, and now they may see you as a threat." James felt his hands go cold. He wasn't prepared for this turn of events. "That's why I'm here," Mr. Harrison continued. "I've come not only to thank you, but to offer you protection. You're not going to be returning home anytime soon. We're taking you to a safe place until this situation is sorted out." James was stunned. Yesterday he had simply stopped to help, and today his life was in danger. He didn't know how to react, but he knew he had to make a decision quickly. "I will do everything to ensure that this situation does not harm you, but for that we need to act immediately," Mr. Harrison added firmly in his voice. James looked at the house that had symbolized peace and safety to him just a second ago. Now he had a choice: stay and take his chances, or trust a man he had only known for a few minutes. After a moment's thought, James nodded. He realized that this was not just a noble gesture. This was a fight for his life, in which the future depended on his decisions. James was not a man who trusted strangers easily, especially those who suddenly appeared on his doorstep with disturbing news. However, Mr. Harrison's words, and especially his seriousness and confidence, made James accept the offer. "Well, it looks like I don't have many options," he replied, trying to keep his voice calm even though his insides were seething. "What do you suggest we do next?" Mr. Harrison nodded, apparently expecting this answer. "First thing we have to do is leave this place. We have a safe house a few hours away. We'll move there until I sort this out." James wanted to ask how long it would take, but Harrison's serious look stopped him. He knew the answer to that question was more of a guess than a certainty. "Mr. Harrison stepped back and pointed at the SUV. "We don't have much time. Please take only the essentials." James, realizing the gravity of the situation, headed into the house. He quickly packed a small suitcase, throwing in a few changes of clothes, a phone charger, and documents. While he was packing, his thoughts were racing through his head. How did it happen that his life was suddenly in danger? He tried to figure out if he had another choice, but all paths led to the same conclusion: he needed to leave. Returning to Mr. Harrison, James felt a slight tremor in his hands. He had never been in a situation like this before, and everything that was happening seemed unreal. He got into the car, and when the door slammed behind him, the feeling that he was leaving forever became even stronger. The SUV pulled away, and silence fell over the cabin. The driver stared straight ahead, showing no interest in James, and Mr. Harrison scrolled through his phone. James, unsure of what to do, also looked out the window, watching the familiar landscape slowly disappear. Several minutes passed before Mr. Harrison broke the silence. "I know this is a shock to you, but I promise I will do everything I can to protect you. I have connections, resources, and people who can help." "But what makes you so sure I'm in danger?" James finally asked, unable to bear the tension. "I just helped your wife, and frankly, I didn't expect anything in return, much less this turn of events." Mr. Harrison put the phone down and looked at James with understanding. "You found yourself in the middle of a very difficult situation that's been brewing for a long time. These people, they don't forgive interference, even if it was accidental. For them, it's a matter of principle, and unfortunately, you've become part of their game." James could hardly believe what was happening. He was a simple man, far from the world of intrigue and danger. "What will happen next? How long will I have to hide?" Mr. Harrison sighed heavily. "It depends on how quickly we can solve this problem. We'll be working on it around the clock, but I can't promise it will be quick." "And how is your wife?" James asked unexpectedly. "She wasn't hurt, was she?" "No," Harrison replied, his expression softening for the first time in the conversation. "Thanks to you, she's safe. We got her out of town right away after that. She's in a safe place now." James felt some relief, although he knew that his own problems were just beginning. Meanwhile, the SUV continued on its way, taking him further and further from home and his usual life. As they entered a quiet wooded area, James noticed how the atmosphere around them became even more tense. It seemed that every sound, every rustle was a harbinger of something dangerous. Finally, they drove up to a large country house surrounded by a high fence. The gates opened automatically, and the car drove into the territory. "Welcome to your new home for a while," Mr. Harrison said as they got out of the car. "You'll be safe here. The house is equipped with everything you need, and our people will be there to help you if needed." James looked around. The house was impressive, but somehow cold and lifeless. Everything inside was furnished in a sober but tasteful manner, as if it had never been lived in. Harrison led him into one of the bedrooms, showed him the bathroom and kitchen. He explained that the house had everything he needed for a comfortable stay, and assured him that they would keep him informed of all developments. "I'll leave you to rest. If you need anything, don't hesitate to call," he said, handing James a card with a phone number on it. "And try not to leave the station without my permission." James nodded, feeling like his head was still spinning. When Harrison left, he was alone in an unfamiliar house, feeling a strange emptiness inside. All he wanted was to go back to his normal life, but he knew that was impossible now. Night came quickly, and with it came a sense of unease. James could not sleep, and restless thoughts swirled in his head. He went to the window and looked at the stars, which seemed closer in this quiet, distant place. "How did this happen?" he whispered quietly to himself, trying to comprehend how quickly everything had changed. He knew that there was an unknown ahead, and he needed to be prepared for any surprises. But the hardest part was the feeling that he was no longer in control of his life. Decisions that had once been so simple were now out of his hands. All he could do was trust people he barely knew and hope that it would all end well. The next morning, James was awakened by a knock on the door. When he opened it, he saw another stranger dressed in a military uniform. "Mr. James?" he asked, his face serious. "My name is Michael. I am responsible for your safety. We need to discuss a plan of action." James knew this conversation was inevitable. Ahead of him lay not only the fight for his own safety, but also an attempt to understand a world that suddenly seemed full of threats and hidden enemies. James stood at the threshold, examining the new visitor, Michael. Unlike Mr. Harrison, this man looked even more collected and serious, with a bearing that came from years of service. His military uniform fit him perfectly, as if he were the embodiment of discipline and order. But in his eyes, despite the hardness, there was a weariness, as if he were a man who had seen more than he wanted to many times. "You need to sit down, Mr. James. This is not going to be an easy conversation," Michael said, gesturing for James to follow him into the living room. There was a strange silence inside the house, broken only by the quiet ticking of the clock on the wall. James, feeling the tension growing, sat down on the leather sofa. Michael took the seat opposite, placing a folder of documents on the table in front of him. "What else awaits me?" James thought, feeling the nervous tension squeezing his chest. Michael seemed to sense his condition, so he didn't waste time and got straight to the point. "Mr. James, your situation is more complex than it may seem at first glance. The people you have unwittingly encountered are not just common criminals. They are a network with significant influence and resources. They operate in the shadows, silently, but very effectively, and now you have become their target." James winced at this, wanting to ask how he could be targeted by such people, but Michael continued, not letting him get a word in. "You saved Mr. Harrison's wife, and that's enough to get their attention, but there's something else you should know." Michael opened the folder and pulled out a photograph. It showed a woman whose face James recognized immediately. It was the same woman he had helped on the road. But now, instead of gratitude, James saw fear on her face. The photograph had been taken from afar, clearly in a hurry, as if someone was trying to sneakily capture her in the frame. This woman, Mrs. Harrison, was targeted by the group we're dealing with. They were planning to kidnap her to put pressure on Mr. Harrison, but your intervention foiled their plans, and now they see you as a serious threat. "But why me? I'm just a random passerby," James exclaimed, feeling panic begin to creep up on him. "I just wanted to help." "I understand," Michael replied calmly, keeping his tone firm, "but they don't see it that way. To them, you're an unknown factor, someone who interfered with their plans and went unnoticed. They can't afford to have someone they don't control in the game, so now you're in danger, and we need to take action to protect you." "Who are these people? Why are they so important?" James could hardly comprehend the scale of the problem. Michael's words seemed to pull him out of his usual world and into some dark reality he had never thought about before. Michael sighed heavily and looked James straight in the eye. "This is a very dangerous group. They do not shy away from blackmail or murder. Their goal is money and power, and they are ready to do anything to achieve this. Mr. Harrison, being an influential businessman, has long been their target, but all this time he's skillfully avoided direct confrontation. Now the situation has changed. And what do you suggest?" James tried to regain control of the situation. Although he knew it was impossible, he could only rely on those who were more prepared for such circumstances. "First, we have heavy security on this house. You will be safe here until we decide what to do next. Second, I recommend that you do not contact anyone who has not been approved by me or Mr. Harrison. We need to be sure that you are not being tracked." James knew these measures were necessary, but he still couldn't shake the feeling that his life would never be the same again. He felt trapped, with every step predetermined by someone else. However, Michael was not finished. "There's one more thing," he continued, pulling another photo out of the folder. This time it was of James himself, clearly taken from a distance, perhaps even without his knowledge. "They already know who you are, and they may have information about your loved ones." These words pierced James like a sharp knife. He suddenly realized that the danger was not only for him, but also for those he loved. "My family," he whispered, feeling fear creeping up on him. "Could they come after them?" Michael nodded, his face remaining serious. "We've already taken measures. Your family is under guard, but I strongly recommend that you do not contact them, so as not to attract attention." James felt something inside him break. He was prepared for many things, but not to be separated from his loved ones for their safety. The thought of someone threatening his family because of what he had done was unbearable. "You must trust us," Michael said softly, seeing James's state. "We know what we're doing, but I ask you to be careful and follow our instructions." James nodded, though his mind was elsewhere. All he wanted was to hear the voices of his loved ones, to make sure they were okay, but he knew that would only make things worse. Michael stood up and headed for the door. "I'll leave you alone. Please get some rest. We'll continue discussing our actions tomorrow morning." When the door closed behind Michael, James was alone. There was silence around him, but chaos reigned in his head. He went to the window and looked out at the dark forest surrounding the house. There, among the trees, lurked the unknown that was now part of his life. His world, once so simple and understandable, collapsed in one day. He wanted to believe that this was just a nightmare that would soon end, but he knew that it was not so. Now every step he took, every decision could be fatal. James sank heavily onto his bed, feeling fatigue wash over him like a wave, but sleep wouldn't come. His head was filled with fragments of thoughts, memories of a quiet life that now seemed so distant. His family, his home, his normal routine, all of it was now under threat. As James's eyes finally began to close from exhaustion, the phone on his nightstand vibrated. He woke up abruptly, his heart pounding. The phone, it could have been his family, but Michael had warned him. He picked up the phone, but the number was unknown. His fingers were shaking, but he answered. "Hello, James." The voice on the other end was cold and unfamiliar. "We know where your loved ones are. Make the wrong move, and they will suffer. The clock is ticking. The choice is yours." The line went dead, leaving James in the dark, both literally and figuratively. He knew now that the enemy would stop at nothing, and the choice they were talking about wasn't a choice between safety and danger, it was a choice between sacrifices, and James desperately didn't want to make it. James sat in the dark, clutching the phone so tightly that his knuckles turned white. The words from the call echoed in his head like a terrible but inevitable sentence. "We know where your loved ones are." The words pierced his mind like a knife, turning everything inside out. He felt an icy cold of fear that pierced him to the depths of his soul. The situation that had seemed incredible and distant now became all too real and close. He had to do something. But what? His thoughts were tangled like a spider's web. He wanted to call Michael, but he knew it might not help. James understood that he had gotten into a game where the rules were dictated by others, and every action he took could lead to unpredictable consequences. Finally, he forced himself to stand up and take a deep breath. Panic wouldn't help. He had to think, and he had to think clearly and quickly. James walked around the house, checking all the windows and doors. The house was indeed a fortress, with strong locks and reinforced glass, but it felt like the walls were closing in on him, sapping the last of his air. He felt like an animal cornered with no way out. The only thing that worried him most now was the safety of his family. Michael had said that they were protected, but now James was beginning to doubt. This call showed that the enemy was one step ahead, and it would not be difficult for them to get to those he loved. He picked up his phone again. He scrolled through his contacts until he came to his wife's name, Jessica. Her face immediately appeared in his mind's eye, as if she were standing right in front of him, her warm smile, the glint in her eyes as she looked at him. James bit his lip, trying to resist the urge to call her, to hear her voice, to make sure she was okay, but he knew that would be a fatal mistake. If his enemies were monitoring his calls, it would only embolden them to take action. James took a deep breath, trying to calm himself. He needed to come up with a plan, something that could save everyone. He felt helpless in this moment, more than ever. He had dealt with adversity in the past, but this was something completely different. This wasn't just a test, this was a fight for life, and the lives of those he cared about were at stake. Suddenly he remembered Michael's words about not trusting anyone who wasn't approved. So could the call have been a hoax? Or, on the contrary, a real threat? He didn't know, and that was the worst part. He didn't know who to trust but himself. Suddenly, in complete silence, the phone vibrated again. James brought it sharply to his ear, his heart pounding like crazy again. "James, it's me, Michael," came a calm but tense voice. "I just learned that the signal was intercepted. Did you get the call?" "Yes." James's voice shook, but he tried to sound confident. "They said they knew where my family was. They were threatening them." "Damn." Michael paused for a moment, then continued. "Listen to me carefully. You have to trust only me. I know it sounds scary, but if you give in now, they will take over. Your family is under protection. I am personally handling it. But how can I be sure of that?" James felt panic rising again. "I can't just sit here and wait for them to make the first move." Michael sighed heavily. I understand, but it's important to keep your cool right now. I've already sent a team to your house. They'll check the perimeter and provide extra security. If anything happens, you'll be the first to know." James paused, considering Michael's words. He wanted to believe that everything was under control, but his intuition told him otherwise. "What should I do?" he finally asked. "Just stay put and don't panic," Michael replied. "I'll be there soon. Together we'll figure out what to do next." When the call ended, James felt a slight sense of relief, but the tension remained. He looked around the house again, as if trying to convince himself that he was safe, but the fear for his family did not go away. Half an hour passed before Michael arrived. He looked serious but collected as he entered the house. He was followed by 2 men in military uniforms who immediately began to inspect the premises. "We've tightened security around your family," Michael said once he was alone with James, "and now I want you to understand that everything we do is to protect you both. These people are playing dirty, but we're going to outmaneuver them." "But what if they're already close? What if I'm the reason my family is now in danger?" James couldn't shake off the feeling of guilt. He felt like his desire to help had led to disaster. "You did what you had to do. You saved a man," Michael replied with unexpected warmth in his voice. "Now it's our job to save you and those you care about." But before Michael could finish speaking, one of the soldiers returned with an anxious expression on his face. "Sir, we need to check one thing," he said, turning to Michael. "What happened?" James tensed, feeling that something was wrong. "The perimeter is clear, but there is one anomaly. We have detected a suspicious signal nearby. It is moving towards the house." Michael reacted instantly. "Get ready, we can't let them get too close." James felt his heart beat faster again. The situation was starting to escalate. Michael and his team immediately took up positions, preparing for any possible threat. James knew that his life was now hanging by a thread. Michael gave him a determined look. "They won't get through. We'll protect you." Footsteps were heard outside. Someone was approaching the house. James stood in the center of the room, not knowing what to do. Panic was starting to overtake him again, but he tried to remain calm. Suddenly there was a loud knock on the door. James felt the ground slipping from under his feet. Everyone in the house froze, preparing for the worst. Michael raised his hand, gesturing for everyone to remain seated. He walked slowly to the door, holding his gun at the ready. The silence was unbearable. Every sound seemed louder than it actually was. "Who's there?" Michael asked loudly, his hand on the door handle. "It's Jessica," a female voice said from outside. "Open up, James." "It's me." James froze. His wife was here. How could she have gotten here? Fear and confusion filled him. Something was wrong. Michael looked at James, his face hardening. "Don't open it. It could be a trap." But James couldn't ignore his wife's voice. "It's definitely her." His voice trembled with excitement. He went to the door, but Michael stopped him. "Wait, we need to be sure." Michael cautiously approached the window to look out. What he saw made him turn away abruptly and order his men to take up fighting positions. "What's going on?" James couldn't hide his fear any longer. Michael turned to face him, and James saw something in his eyes that made him go cold. "It's not just Jessica," he said, his voice cold and tight. "She's at gunpoint. If you open the door, they'll kill her right away. And us." James felt his legs give way. He tried to make sense of what was happening, but his mind refused to accept this reality. His wife was standing outside, and he could do nothing to help her. There was another knock, but this time it was louder, more aggressive. "James," Jessica's voice sounded scared. "Please open up. They're here." As if in slow motion, James watched as Michael handed him the phone. "We need time to prepare," he said quickly. "Try to buy time. Talk to her, but don't open the door, no matter what." James picked up the phone, his hands shaking. "Jessica, it's me," he said, trying to sound confident. "Are you okay?" "They're holding me." Her voice shook, a mixture of fear and desperation. "They said if you don't open the door, they'll kill me right here." James's wife's words cut him to the heart. Her voice was full of terror, and he knew that she was truly in mortal danger. He looked at Michael, who was preparing for the worst. "I can't open the door, Jessica," James said with difficulty, feeling tears welling up in his throat. "But I'll do everything I can to save you. Just hold on." There was a scream outside and James knew he had no more time. He heard the guns click and knew he was about to begin the most terrifying ordeal of his life. James stood on the edge of despair, clutching the phone in his hand, listening to his wife's trembling voice. He felt completely helpless, and it was driving him crazy. One thought was spinning in his head. What if he really couldn't save her? Fear for Jessica's life paralyzed him, but at the same time, rage was flaring up inside him. How could he allow someone to threaten her? His family? Michael, standing nearby, looked collected, but there was a hint of worry in his eyes. He spoke quietly to one of his men, then turned to James. "You have to buy time. This is the only chance. We are trying to figure out how many there are and where they are located. While you are talking to her, we will be able to figure out how to proceed." James nodded, even though everything inside him screamed against this plan. Every second seemed like an eternity, and with each passing moment the fear grew. He wanted to run to the door, kick it down, grab Jessica and take her as far away from this danger as possible, but he knew that would be stupid and deadly, not just for him, but for her as well. Gathering his strength, he spoke into the phone, trying not to show his fear. "Jessica, listen to me. I know you're scared. I'm here, and I'll do anything to keep you safe, but I can't open the door until I'm sure they've let you go." Outside, someone could be heard pushing Jessica roughly, and she screamed. Her scream pierced James's heart, making him tremble. He felt his rage and fear intertwining, and he had to fight to keep himself from acting rashly. "James, they say that if you don't open the door, they'll kill me right here." Jessica's voice rang out again, full of fear and pain. "Please, do something." His heart sank. He knew he had to keep talking to her, to distract her and give Michael and his men time. But what to say? How to convince her that everything would be okay when he wasn't sure himself? "Jessica, listen to me," he said, trying to sound as calm as he could. "I know you're scared. I'm scared for you, too, but you have to trust me. Michael and I are already working on this. They can't hurt you. We'll stop them." At that moment, Michael raised his hand, getting James's attention. He gestured that there appeared to be at least 3 people outside. One was holding Jessica, and the other 2 were hiding on either side of the house. This made things more difficult, but Michael had already begun to formulate a plan. "We have a plan," Michael said quietly, so James could hear his instructions but not give himself away. "We need to separate them. Try to convince them you're willing to surrender, but make it a condition that they release Jessica to a safe distance." James paused, considering this plan. It was a risky move, but they had no other choice. He spoke into the phone again. "Okay, I'm ready to open the door," he said, his throat dry with excitement. "But first, let Jessica go. I won't let you hurt her. I'll only open the door when I see she's safe." There was a tense silence outside. He could almost feel his enemies considering his offer. This was the moment of truth. Either they would agree, or the worst would happen. Finally, the voice of one of the attackers was heard, rough and hoarse. "Okay, we'll let her go, but if you try to do anything, she'll die. Do you understand me?" "Yes," James said, trying to keep his voice firm. "Let her go, and I'll come out." James heard Jessica being pushed again. She began to back away slowly, her steps heavy and uneven. He tried desperately not to think about what state she might be in, but fear was tearing him apart. Michael motioned for one of his men to keep an eye on Jessica until she was far enough away from the house. Once she was safe, the operation would begin. James walked up to the door and put his hand on the lock, but he didn't open it. He waited for Michael to give him a signal. Time seemed to slow down, every moment dragging on painfully long. Finally, he saw Michael nod. Jessica was safe, but Michael's plan was not yet complete. They had to catch whoever was outside. James opened the door slowly, trying not to show his excitement. He saw them, 2 masked men holding guns. The third stood closer to the woods where Jessica was to be freed. "Where's Jessica?" James demanded, stepping forward to distract their attention. "She's leaving now," one of the attackers replied, holding his gun at the ready. "Now it's your turn. James, come out, and no tricks." James knew he had to stall for time, but he knew every second could be his last. He took another step forward, trying to remain calm. Suddenly a shot rang out. It all happened in an instant. Michael and his men opened fire. The attackers scattered, but they had no chance. The shots sounded muffled, almost like an echo in the night, but for James it was like deafening. He rushed to the door, trying to figure out what was going on. Suddenly he saw Jessica, running towards him, her face twisted in fear. Their eyes met, and James felt his heart squeeze with relief and fear at the same time. "James!" she screamed, and there was horror in her voice. He rushed towards her, despite the danger around him. Bullets whistled past, but his only goal was to hold her, to make sure she was okay. They met halfway down the road, and James held her tightly against him. She was shaking, and he could feel her heart pounding against his hand. He didn't know what to say except to repeat that everything would be okay, that she was safe now. "We made it," Michael said quietly, walking up to them. His face was serious, but there was relief in his eyes. "But it's not over. They weren't alone. We need to leave now." James nodded, still holding Jessica. He knew they were in a dangerous situation, and they had to get out of it. But at that moment, all that mattered to him was that she was alive, and they were together. Michael quickly organized their evacuation, and soon they were racing away from this house, from this nightmare that had almost cost them their lives. New challenges awaited them ahead, but now James knew that he would fight to the last to protect those he loved. In the car, holding Jessica's hand, he realized that their lives would never be the same again. They had entered a world full of danger and uncertainty, and there was no way out. But now he was ready for this fight, because his family's life was at stake, and he was not going to give up. As soon as James and Jessica got into the car, Michael and his men quickly secured them and began the evacuation. James fought back tears, clutching Jessica's hand as if it was the only thing keeping him afloat. Deep inside him, a storm of emotions swirled: fear, relief, anger, all swirling together in a single vortex. When they were a few kilometers away from home, Michael turned to face them, his face still focused and wary. "We need to find a safe place to rethink the situation," he said, looking at James. "But first, we need to make sure we're not being followed." James nodded, realizing that there was still no time to relax. He looked at Jessica, who was sitting next to him. Her face was pale, but she was trying to remain calm. Looking at her, James felt his inner demons slowly recede, although complete relief was still far away. Michael gave his men directions, and soon they were off the main road, heading down a narrow, winding path that led into the woods. This was the place Michael used as a temporary hideout. Known only to a few of his team, the cabin was modest, but well camouflaged, and experience had shown it to be a reliable refuge in an emergency. When they arrived, Michael checked the surroundings before signaling the group to exit the car. The door to the cabin was open, and Michael led James and Jessica inside. It was warm and cozy, but that couldn't mask the sense of unease that filled the room. "We're relatively safe, but we need to rest and prepare for the next step," Michael said, unfolding the map and beginning to study it. "Everything that's happening now could be the start of something much bigger. We need to figure out who's behind this and how we can stop them." James noticed Jessica sitting down on the couch and seemed to be trying to get her thoughts in order. Her eyes were empty, as if she had just had a terrible dream. James brought her a cup of tea that Michael had quickly brewed to help her calm down. "Thank you," she said quietly, taking the cup and looking down. James sat down next to her, hugging her, and felt her body tremble. "We'll get through this," he whispered, trying to sound confident. "We'll get through this, I promise." Michael left the room to talk to the rest of his team, leaving James and Jessica alone. The house became quieter, and James felt the tension slowly fading, but there was a heavy weight on his soul. He felt like he couldn't let go of it until he knew what had really happened and who had tried to harm them. After a while, Michael returned with a serious expression. "We found something important," he said as he entered the room. "It turns out that these people were part of a larger organization, and it looks like they weren't just targeting you. Their goal may have been much broader." James raised his eyebrows, looking at Michael in surprise. "How is that possible? Why did they choose us?" "We don't know all the details yet," Michael replied, "but it appears that you accidentally found yourself in the middle of something bigger. They may have used your kindness as a means to an end. We're gathering information and contacting our sources to find out more." Jessica flinched and James felt her fear return. He noticed her hands were starting to shake and he touched her back, trying to calm her down. "What do we do now?" James asked, turning back to Michael. "How do we stop these people?" "The first step is to find out who they are and what they want," Michael said. "We will continue to seek information, but it is also important to think about security. These people may try to attack again, especially if they know we are here." Michael headed for the window, checking the situation outside the cottage. He was determined, and this gave James confidence, but the internal tension did not disappear, and fear for the future continued to haunt him. "We need to rest and strengthen our positions," Michael continued. "Tomorrow we will begin working on a plan. It is important not only to find information, but also to be prepared for a possible attack." James looked at Jessica and saw her slowly begin to relax. He knew they had a long way to go, and that they were far from safe. But in that moment, as they sat in silence, James felt their bond grow even stronger. They had survived danger together, and now they had to work as a team to deal with what lay ahead. Night fell, and the cabin in the woods was silent. Michael and his team remained on guard, maintaining security and continuing to gather information. James and Jessica tried to rest, but deep sleep did not come. Each of them was lost in their own thoughts, realizing that this evening was the beginning of something much more complex and dangerous. As dawn began to break through the windows, James knew they would face new challenges, but in that moment, he felt a deep sense of determination. They had survived a terrible ordeal, and it had made them stronger. Now they were ready to fight for their safety and their future, no matter what difficulties might come their way. The day began with a steady rain that had been falling since early morning. The water pounded the roof of the forest house, creating a monotonous noise that somehow calmed James. He tried to focus on what was ahead, but every sound outside the window made him tense. He knew they were not yet safe, and this feeling of unease did not leave him. Michael and his team spent the night in active mode, continuing to check the perimeter and discuss plans. Inside the cabin, there was a tense silence, and James and Jessica sat at the table, drunk with fatigue, trying to sort out the events of the previous day. "Are you sure we have all the resources we need?" James asked, trying to hide his concern. "We're doing everything we can," Michael replied, not looking up from the map and notes scattered across the table. "But we need more information about who's behind this attack. It's important to understand what they want and why they chose us." Jessica sat silently, her gaze fixed on the window where water was trickling down the glass. She seemed lost in thought. Her hands were cold and she was hugging herself as if that would help her cope with the cold and fear. "I have an idea," Michael continued, looking up. "We could try to find people who can help us. Contact informants who might know more about groups or organizations operating in the area." "That could be dangerous," James put in. "Maybe we should find out who was here yesterday first. We don't know. Maybe we have some clues." "That's an option," Michael agreed. "But don't forget that if these people weren't working alone, someone else might know more. We need to use all possible sources." Jessica, still silent, suddenly stood up and walked over to the table. She looked at Michael and James with a tense expression. "Maybe I remember something. When they were holding me, I heard one of them talking on the radio. Something like scheduled meetings and moving to phase 2. It could be something important." Michael and James exchanged glances. This could be a clue. "If that's the case, then we need to figure out what phase 2 is as quickly as possible," Michael said. "It could be their game plan or something they're going to do next." Over the next hour, Michael organized a team to gather information. One of his people, Lisa, was a data mining and analytics specialist. She immediately set to work, using her contacts in intelligence circles and criminal databases. James and Jessica helped her provide any details that might be useful. While Lisa worked, James and Jessica went into the woods to conduct an inspection around the cabin. They looked for any traces that might indicate who else might know of their whereabouts. They found several tracks that appeared to have been left by people, possibly the day before. This gave them an additional sense of unease. Returning to the cabin, James noticed that Jessica had become silent and lost in her thoughts. He knew that all this was not easy for her, and he tried to support her as best he could. "Do you want to talk about it?" he asked when they returned. "I just can't understand why this happened," she replied, her voice quiet and confused. "Why us? We're just a normal family. Sometimes things happen that you can't explain," James said, trying to comfort her. "But we have to stay strong. We'll do everything we can to figure this out and get out of this situation." Soon, Lisa approached them with important information. "I found something." The word Phase 2 is related to one of the criminal cartels that operate in the area. They are planning a series of operations that may involve various forms of violence and manipulation. Perhaps your case was part of their plan, and they were going to use you as a means to achieve their goals. James felt his heart beat faster. This discovery gave them a new perspective on the situation. If they were in the middle of some major operation, it meant they had to act quickly and thoughtfully. "What do we do next?" James asked. "We need to find a way to stop them," Lisa replied. "To do that, we need to figure out who else is involved and what their plans are. I suggest we first contact anyone who might be familiar with these criminal groups. Maybe we have connections or resources that can help." Michael nodded in agreement. "We'll start by checking my sources and trying to find contacts who might know more. You stay here and keep an eye on the situation. If they try to find you again, we need to be prepared to respond." James and Jessica spent the day in tense anticipation, preparing for a possible attack. They rested as much as they could and prepared for their next move. As darkness fell over the forest again, Michael returned with more news. "We have information," he said, wiping raindrops from his face. "We have discovered that the cartel's plan involves a major operation that is set to begin in the coming days. We need to act quickly to alert the authorities and possibly gather evidence." James knew their task was just beginning. They now had to work not only to keep themselves safe, but to prevent further crimes. Their lives were intertwined with those who would do anything to achieve their goals, and they had to use all their strength and resources to survive and protect themselves and others. During those tense nights and days, they learned that the fight for survival was not only a physical struggle, but also an intellectual one. They had to solve puzzles, make strategic moves, and keep their cool to get out of this nightmare alive and well. But most importantly, they knew that they were not alone, and that despite everything that lay ahead, they were ready to fight for their lives and their future. Over the next few days, James and Jessica endured the most intense hours of their lives. Each morning began with a check of their hideout and a detailed analysis of the information received. Michael and his team did everything they could to ensure their safety and gather information about the cartel's plans. James, for his part, tried to support Jessica despite her growing anxiety and fear. On the evening of the fourth day, after several tense meetings and sting operations, Michael finally told James he had a plan. "We've learned that the cartel's next phase of the operation involves an attack on a high-value facility with ties to the local government," Michael said, his face serious. "They're going to use it as cover for their next move." "How can we stop this?" asked James, feeling that their whole struggle was approaching a climax. "We have to act quickly. I have contacted some people who can help us with this," Michael continued. "We will provide information to the authorities and monitor the cartel's movements, but we need to be prepared for the fact that they may try to make moves against us." James knew this would not be an easy task. He and Jessica were at the center of a vast conspiracy, and every move they made could be decisive. They gathered and began preparing for the operations they would carry out the night before the supposed attack. Night had come, and James, Jessica, and Michael's team were on high alert. They were about to leave the cabin in the woods and join the operation that would prevent the cartel from attacking. In this place of fear and tension, each of them knew that not only their lives were at stake, but the lives of many others. As soon as they left the shelter, the rain that had been pouring down on the ground for so long stopped. The sky was overcast, and the night swallowed them up like a black curtain. James and Jessica followed Michael and his team through the forest paths, trying to remain silent. They had their radios and other means of communication in their hands, ready to use. Suddenly Michael stopped and put a finger to his lips. He was pointing at a group of people in the distance, the cartel members preparing for the next stage of their plan. James's heart began to pound. He knew this was their chance, and they had to act now. "We need to split up," Michael whispered. "James, Jessica, you come with me. The rest of the team will cover us and keep an eye on their movements. If all goes according to plan, we can prevent the attack." James nodded and took Jessica's hand. They followed Michael, making their way through the dark woods and past the sound of rain. Lights flickered on the horizon, and as they got closer, James saw that the target they were about to attack was guarded and protected. James' heart was pounding as they approached the building they were targeting. They noticed the cartel men starting to move towards it. It was time for a decisive move. James and Jessica hid behind nearby cover while Michael and his team intercepted the guards and began the operation. A deafening shot shattered the silence of the night, and immediately a gunfight erupted. James could feel his body reacting to the stress, every movement laced with fear and determination. Jessica, standing nearby, tried to remain calm, but her face was pale with fear. Michael and his men were masters of their craft. They skillfully coordinated actions and prevented any developments in their unfavorable direction. Gradually, the situation began to stabilize. When the first attack was repelled, the authorities, notified by Michael and his team, arrived on the scene and began an operation to detain the remaining cartel members. Finally, after hours of intense fighting, they had dealt with the main threat. James and Jessica watched as law enforcement officers took into custody those who remained at the scene. The rain had started again, but it didn't seem so threatening now. It was simply the backdrop to this long-awaited victory. Michael walked up to James and Jessica, his face tired but satisfied. "We did it," he said. "Now the cartel has lost control of the situation, and their plan has been foiled. We've averted a disaster." James breathed a sigh of relief, feeling his tension begin to ease. He looked at Jessica, who, despite her fatigue, smiled. It was a smile full of gratitude and relief. "Thank you, Michael," James said. "You saved our lives." Michael nodded. "We just did what we had to do. Now you need to get back to your normal life. But remember, you can always count on help if something goes wrong." When they returned to the cabin in the woods, everything looked different. The place was no longer just a place of refuge, but a symbol of their struggle and overcoming. James and Jessica spent their last night in the cabin, knowing that their lives would begin to take shape again. The next day, they left the forest house and headed back to their normal existence. But the experience they had lived through had changed them forever. Now they knew that they could overcome any difficulties if they worked together and supported each other. Some time passed, and James and Jessica tried to rebuild their lives. The constant feeling of safety had not yet returned, but they worked to create a new, safe reality for themselves. Their relationship grew stronger, and they learned to appreciate every moment they spent together. Every day brought new challenges, but they knew they were capable of overcoming any difficulties. Their lives were back on track to normalcy, and although the former innocence was lost, they gained invaluable experience and an understanding of the value of life and safety. This is the end of this wonderful story. I hope you liked it, and you were imbued with this atmosphere. Don't forget to subscribe to the channel as it promotes my video. Thank you everyone for watching. Bye everyone.